The flames tore through the quiet neighborhood of Allenton, Derby like a monster unleashed, but this wasn't an accident. As firefighters struggled to rescue 6 children trapped inside, the truth behind the inferno was darker than anyone could have imagined. What kind of parent sets fire to their own home, while their children sleep inside? It was around 3:45 a.m. on May 11, 2012, when neighbors on Victory Road in Derby were jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass and screams echoing through the quiet night. A house, number 18, was engulfed in flames, thick smoke billowing from the windows, turning the suburban street into a scene from a nightmare. Within minutes, fire engines arrived, their sirens piercing through the haze. Flames surged through the front of the house, blocking the main exit, trapping the children inside. It was chaos. Firefighters, working in suffocating heat and limited visibility, forced their way into the building, dragging unconscious children from the bedrooms, one by one. Outside, the children's parents, Mick and Philpott, stood in the street. Mick was hysterical, screaming and flailing his arms, attempting to get back inside. Cameras captured him collapsing on the pavement, weeping as firefighters carried out limp bodies wrapped in blankets. Mairead, sobbing, clutched her face as neighbors tried to console her. The children, ranging from 5 to 13 years old, were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. 5 were pronounced dead on arrival. The 6th, the oldest boy, Duane, was placed on life support. He died 2 days later. 6 children gone in the blink of an eye. The entire nation watched in horror as the tragedy unfolded live on news broadcasts. The community response was immediate. A memorial of flowers, teddy bears, and candles grew outside the blackened shell of the house. Vigils were held. Strangers came to grieve. The deaths were seen as a national tragedy, and donations poured in for the family. The media framed Mick and Mairead as devastated victims. Mick, who had previously appeared on talk shows for his unusual family setup, now found himself the face of parental grief. He gave an emotional press conference, standing next to police officers, his voice trembling as he thanked emergency services and begged for help catching whoever had started the fire. But behind the tears and theatrics, something wasn't right. Those who had known the Philpotts began to whisper. Fire investigators started combing through the wreckage. The fire had started in the hallway, just inside the front door, and evidence quickly indicated that it had been ignited using petrol. There were no signs of an electrical fault, no candles, no accident. It wasn't a gas leak. This was deliberate. Accelerants had been poured through the letterbox and lit from the outside. It was murder. Even more unsettling was Mick Philpott's behavior in the days following the fire. While his public display was one of anguish, privately he seemed eager to be at the center of attention. He gave multiple interviews to reporters, always making sure cameras caught his emotional breakdowns. But those close to the investigation noticed inconsistencies. He talked too much. He seemed to know more about the fire than he should have. Detectives noted how his grief lacked authenticity. It was performative, as if he were acting a part he had written for himself. Neighbors who had gathered outside the home also reported seeing him directing camera crews and asking when press would return. He didn't shy away from the limelight, he craved it. Police began to watch him more closely, studying CCTV footage from nearby buildings looking for clues. Forensic teams scoured the charred remains of the house. Meanwhile, the coroner's reports came in confirming what many feared. All 6 children had died from smoke inhalation. They hadn't stood a chance. With the shock of the fire still hanging heavily over Derby, authorities worked quietly but relentlessly. Mick and Mairead's statements were analyzed. Reenactments were staged. Petrol traces were matched. Investigators began to look at motive, and what they uncovered hinted at something truly sinister. While the public mourned, detectives were closing in. This wasn't just arson. It was premeditated. Planned. And perhaps, just perhaps, the grieving parents weren't victims at all. They might have been orchestrators. The horror of 6 innocent lives being taken in their sleep was enough to devastate a nation, but the idea that the parents, the ones who should have been their protectors, could be involved transformed the tragedy into something even darker. Behind the smoke, the grief, and the media frenzy, a web of lies and manipulation was beginning to unravel. And at the center of it stood Mick Philpott, a man who had lost his children in the most horrific way imaginable. But as the days turned into weeks, the question became impossible to ignore. Was he mourning a loss or covering up a crime? As the ashes cooled and the funeral arrangements for 6 innocent children were underway, the investigation behind the Derby fire intensified. What initially seemed like a cruel act of random arson was no longer fitting the mold. Fire specialists had already ruled out all accidental causes. The way the blaze had started, concentrated at the base of the stairs fueled by petrol, told them it was deliberate. And it wasn't just about how the fire began, it was about who had the opportunity, access, and motive. The circle of suspicion tightened, and surprisingly, it wasn't strangers or distant enemies who drew attention. It was those closest to the victims. Police turned their attention to the family. Mick Philpott, in particular, emerged as a complex and unsettling figure. He was already known to local authorities, not for violent crimes, but for his bizarre domestic situation. Living in a council house, Mick had fathered 17 children with 5 different women. At the time of the fire, he was living with his wife, Mairead, and also shared the home with his former mistress, Lisa Willis, the mother of several of his children. The dynamic raised eyebrows, but what alarmed investigators was the recent turmoil surrounding Mick's relationship with Lisa. Just months before the fire, Lisa had left Mick, taking her children with her. She had moved out, filed for custody, and applied for child benefits in her own name, breaking free from his control. This enraged Mick. He had always prided himself on being in command of his household, dictating the movements and decisions of both women. The split disrupted his system. It also impacted his benefits and public image. Mick was obsessed with public perception. He had appeared on talk shows defending his lifestyle, positioning himself as a man managing a large and complicated family unit. Now that image was falling apart. Investigators began to piece together the psychological profile behind the grief-stricken father. He wasn't just grieving, he was spiraling. Interviews with neighbors, past partners, and even Mairead herself revealed a deeply controlling man, manipulative and temperamental. Mick saw the loss of Lisa and her children not as heartbreak, but as humiliation. It was personal. And in that loss, detectives believed they saw the seeds of revenge. It was surveillance footage from a nearby petrol station that offered a crucial breakthrough. On the night before the fire, Mairead and a family friend, Paul Mosley, were caught on camera filling a petrol container. They claimed it was for lawn equipment. But investigators knew better. Why would someone need petrol at midnight? Why was it brought into the house? Their alibis began to collapse under scrutiny. When confronted with the footage, both Mairead and Mosley grew nervous and inconsistent. Meanwhile, Mick's behavior was becoming more erratic. He still performed grief in public, but behind closed doors he was reportedly pressuring Mairead to remain silent. Forensic analysis confirmed that the accelerant used in the fire matched the petrol from the container Mairead and Mosley had bought. Moreover, fire patterns in the home indicated that the blaze was set from inside, likely through the letterbox with a lit accelerant-soaked rag. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was methodically planned. Each step, obtaining the petrol, choosing the entry point, waiting until the children were asleep, pointed to intention. With the forensic evidence mounting, detectives interrogated Mairead separately. Under pressure she began to crack. Her loyalty to Mick, long sustained by fear and dependency, began to waver. She revealed disturbing details about the days leading up to the fire. Mick had allegedly spoken of framing Lisa Willis for arson, suggesting that if the house went up in flames, Lisa would be blamed and Mick would regain custody of her children. His warped plan was rooted in manipulation, not just of people but of the system. He wanted to engineer a crisis that would restore his dominance. Paul Mosley, once seen as an outsider to the family dynamic, turned out to be far more involved. He had been part of the plot, recruited by Mick, and possibly enticed by drugs and Mairead's coerced participation. The three of them, Mick, Mairead and Mosley, had conspired to set the fire, never imagining it would claim all 6 children's lives. In their twisted minds, it was meant to be a scare tactic, a calculated disaster with a controlled outcome. But fire is uncontrollable and so was the fallout. With sufficient evidence in hand, all 3 were arrested. The community that had once rallied behind the grieving parents now turned with horror. How could a father orchestrate the deaths of his own children? How could a mother stand by, complicit in their final desperate moments? The media, once sympathetic, now tore into the family's dark secrets. The story shifted from tragic loss to calculated murder. Police held press conferences revealing the timeline, the motive, and the chilling orchestration. Derby, and indeed the entire UK, was left stunned. The facade had fully crumbled. What was once grief was now exposed as guilt. The nation braced itself for the trial that would follow, one that would not only lay bare the details of that horrific night, but also expose the monstrous psychology of a father who saw his children not as lives to be cherished, but as pawns in a grotesque game of power. The courtroom was packed, media crews crowded outside, and the nation watched as one of the most disturbing criminal trials in modern British history began. Mick Philpott, Mairead Philpott and Paul Mosley stood in the dock, charged with 6 counts of manslaughter. The air inside the courtroom was heavy with disbelief and anticipation. This wasn't just a trial about a fire, it was about the lengths a man would go to manipulate the system, to destroy the lives of those closest to him, and to maintain control over a crumbling household he treated like his personal empire. Prosecutors laid out a disturbing chain of events. Mick had masterminded the fire, intending to frame his ex-mistress Lisa Willis for arson. His motive was rooted in obsession and dominance. Losing custody of her children, his children, had shaken his world. But it wasn't the love of a father that drove him, it was the humiliation of losing control, of being defied by a woman he once dictated every move of. Setting the fire was supposed to be his twisted solution. He wanted to be the grieving father, the heroic survivor, the victim of a jealous ex-partner. It was a performance he had rehearsed in his mind. The tears, the media sympathy, the public outcry against Lisa. In that vision he'd win custody, regain benefits and restore his image. The plan, however, spiraled into a nightmare. The children weren't meant to die, at least not according to the defense. But that did little to lessen the horror of what had occurred. 6 children aged between 5 and 13 had suffocated in their sleep while their father stood outside, putting on a show for the cameras. Prosecutors argued that the moment Mick Philpott poured petrol and ignited the hallway, he accepted the risk, a risk that resulted in mass death. Throughout the trial, the prosecution painted Mick as a narcissist, a man obsessed with power and control, particularly over women. Testimony after testimony revealed a disturbing pattern. He had physically and psychologically dominated Mairead for years. She was submissive, manipulated, and allegedly brainwashed into believing in his plan. But her involvement was undeniable. She had helped buy the petrol. She had watched as the plan unfolded. And she had done nothing to stop it. Paul Mosley's presence added another layer of moral decay. A friend of Mick's, he had been pulled into the scheme under the influence of drugs, alcohol, and the promise of sex. It was revealed during trial that Mick had coerced Mairead into sexual acts with Mosley as part of a disturbing tactic to maintain his influence over them both. To the jury, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't just about one criminal act. It was about a toxic ecosystem of exploitation that Mick had created, with himself at the center. The prosecution's evidence was airtight. The petrol traces matched. The timeline was precise. CCTV footage showed Mairead and Mosley at the petrol station. Witnesses described Mick's strange behavior. And forensic experts confirmed that the fire started in a location designed to block the only exit, ensuring that once lit, there would be no escape. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a trap. The defense struggled. They argued that it had been a prank gone wrong, a scare tactic intended only to set a small fire and draw attention to Mick's plight. But no one was buying it. The public had turned. The same man who once gave weeping press conferences outside a burnt-down home was now exposed as a calculating monster. His tears were rehearsed. His grief was hollow. He had stood over his children's coffins, knowing full well that he had started the fire that killed them. As the trial reached its conclusion, the verdicts came swiftly. Guilty. All 3, Mick Philpott, Mairead Philpott and Paul Mosley, were convicted of manslaughter. The judge didn't mince words during sentencing. Mick was described as a disturbingly dangerous man, someone who used the people around him as tools for manipulation, with no regard for their autonomy or lives. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years to serve. Mairead and Mosley received 17 years each, with the expectation that they would serve at least half. The country recoiled. What made the Derby fire so haunting wasn't just the scale of loss, it was the betrayal. Parents are supposed to protect. They're supposed to give their lives if necessary to save their children. But in this case, a father had turned into an executioner, and a mother had become his accomplice. The tragedy left a scar not only on Derby but on the national consciousness. It sparked debates about child protection, welfare abuse, and how manipulation can go unchecked behind closed doors. In the aftermath, the remains of the house on Victory Road were demolished. A memorial was erected in its place. A quiet tribute to 6 lives lost in the most senseless way. For weeks, letters, stuffed animals, and candles continued to appear. Strangers wept for children they never met. And though justice had been served in a legal sense, nothing could undo the horror that had occurred inside that house. The flames were long extinguished, but the story of the Derby family massacre would burn in the minds of the public for years to come. A reminder of how evil can sometimes wear the mask of fatherhood, and how trust can be shattered in the dead of night.